this episode of the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. And on today's episode, we're going to discuss how athletes can handle coming back from breaks. Now, breaks can occur in all sorts of different ways, whether they be based on injuries, extended breaks, or shorter breaks based on an injury. And we'll discuss how this might be a little bit different in an individual sport like tennis or in a team setting, which can also occur in tennis as well as other sports. And also, as we know, particularly last year with the COVID pandemic, breaks can happen for all different sorts of other reasons. So in this episode, we'll talk about some of our experiences helping athletes handle breaks, as well as some issues with returning to play after an injury or after a break, and some strategies that can help athletes along this process. Um, so why don't we start with discussing some different types of breaks that athletes have encountered or are encountering, and some of the challenges associated with each of them.
Yeah, so I think you named a couple there, Josh. Injuries, and I think with respect to injuries, sometimes there are, the nature of the injury may dictate, of course, how long one is out. So there are major injuries which could require, greater say than 3 months, which may lead to sort of different feelings and then how you feel when you come back. There may be more minor injuries that are just a couple of weeks. So I think we could split some of that up. I think also another break to talk about is simply if, and hopefully players are doing this because I think it's important. Because in tennis, it feels like there's no off season. I mean, the pros barely seem to have an off season, but even we're in the tennis industry. It just sort of rolls from indoor season to outdoor season, and then there's one league after another. Here in New England, at least here in Massachusetts, there are different indoor leagues, and then they roll into a spring league, which normally would roll into a USTA summer league or something else. And there's really no breaks there. So as a tennis player, sometimes we have to create a recovery period for ourselves, and that could be 1 or 2 weeks, and there can be some anxiety with taking that time because everybody else is playing or there are tournaments at that time, and we don't want to miss out or we don't want to lose our rhythm or something going on there. So I think it's good to associate some positive goals with taking that type of break as well. So I think let's start with the injury one, Josh. Right. So when we have, let's I guess begin with the minor injury. What are some potential concerns if someone say hamstring pull or something like that? That's going to be a 2 to 3 week break. What might be some of the psychological effects of that or aspects of that type of break?
Yeah, I think a big one there, and actually we were talking about this off air a little bit, is that players or athletes very commonly will try to rush back from injuries, which can lead to a lot of issues, including re-injuring yourself and
Right.
maybe making that injury worse. So I think a big piece is knowing when to return and knowing, okay, do we want to come back 100%? Do we want to sort of ease back into it? So I think that's definitely a big one, but also the lack of confidence that a lot of athletes deal with upon return, whether that be actually in the injured muscle itself, or whatever the injury was itself. So, maybe trusting that hamstring upon return, but also that confidence in their game, especially if they haven't been practicing or maybe have practiced in a limited way, trusting that they'll be able to perform at their highest level. If it's been maybe a little more than a couple of weeks, perhaps a month or two, maybe they don't feel match ready at that point because they haven't had those reps of playing matches, of competing, and we've talked about that skill of competing can go a little bit rusty, can needs to be practiced and refined. So I would say the confidence piece upon return can definitely be challenging, and also just feeling comfortable on the court, feeling that rhythm after that break can be a challenge. But also making sure that players who are eager to play and compete and be out there don't rush back, because I think we've all seen it, maybe in our own lives or maybe with people around us, that when people rush back, there's a high likelihood of re-injury and of making the situation much worse than if you took it a little bit slower and eased back into things.
I think that eagerness to get back out there probably is a challenge for everybody. I think I've definitely experienced that with different injuries, and perhaps even depending on the injury, maybe you can be still practicing during that time, say more stationary type of things. If it's, say, an ankle or a hamstring, and so you could just maybe hit cross court or do something very stationary where you're not doing anything explosive, versus another injury where it might be arm related and that could be more restrictive. But yeah, you're right. I think because it's, quote unquote minor, we might think, oh, well, I can just get right back out there and see how it goes. As you said, it could perpetuate or you could re-injure that. And so I think to me, that's like the biggest challenge for someone, especially if it's an injury they haven't had before, because you don't really quite know how where you are in that rehab process there. If it's an injury you've had before, you probably have some sense of, okay, when it gets to this point, I know it's 100% and I can trust it. But with any injury that you've had for the first time, there's always, I think, that uncertainty factor. And I think that's one of the biggest pieces. I mean, just with anxiety in general, uncertainty is one of the greatest contributors to that. And that's certainly the case when you're returning from break. The uncertainty of, all right, how is the injury, or the uncertainty of, will I find my game? I think, especially for younger players, even if it is just say a week. So, the time that we're recording this is just ahead of school break in Massachusetts. So a lot of players are actually going away and may not be able to play, and then there's some anxiety about, oh, how am I going to play when I get back? I'm going to be so rusty, because many of them are not used to taking a week off at any period of time. And so there's that uncertainty factor that begins to create some anxiety. And I think it's up to people like you and me and coaches to say, don't worry about it. You're not going to forget how to play tennis in a week, and we'll get you back to where we know you can be, probably within an hour of your return to practice when you've just taken a week off. And so I think it's that uncertainty. And I know I felt this when I've had a minor injury. Like, I don't want to lose my rhythm. So I'm anxious to get back out there, especially, this is especially true if I feel like I've been in a place where I've been playing well. I don't want to stop. Now, that's also been a problem for me in the past as well. But I can understand how players would feel in that situation. So when we're taking breaks, there's a lot of different dynamics going on, especially with respect to injuries that might be minor. Um, Major injuries, I think, probably cause some different types of anxieties, or have some different psychological impacts when those begin, when that recovery process begins.
Yeah, and I think with major injuries, you're more likely to miss out on bigger opportunities, whether that be a large tournament that you have your eye on the calendar, maybe a national tournament, or maybe one of the sectional tournaments that you're really looking forward to, or in a team setting, maybe with high school or college tennis, it's a rivalry match, or it's the championship for your conference. So I think with major injuries, the missing out of big events and of big matches is definitely an important factor, and can be really challenging for a lot of athletes. I mean, I remember last year when the pandemic hit, again, a little bit different than a long injury, but just the challenges that so many athletes were going through. I mean, I was working at a university, and the just seeing how athletes were struggling with that time, whether it be seniors who were ending their college careers on this note, or freshmen, sophomores, juniors who were excited for the rest of the season and the championships coming up. And felt that they were in a good place. And as you mentioned, Brian, especially when somebody feels like they're playing well and things are going well, it can be challenging, but it could also be challenging the other way if somebody's been having a tougher time, or sort of going through a slump, and then the season ends on that kind of a note, rather than being able to sort of work your way through it. But as it relates to longer term injuries and more serious injuries, I think some of the other challenges are this loss of identity that can take place. Especially like in a team setting, like college tennis, or like adult USTA teams, when somebody's used to having a certain role on that team, and then all of a sudden for many months they no longer have that role. They're no longer in the lineup. They're no longer maybe at practice every day, or competing at practice in the same way that they normally would. So what are some from your viewpoint and your experience, what are some things that coaches can do to help with that process, to help athletes maybe not feel as isolated, or lose that identity and role on the team quite as much during that long injury break?
One thing to consider right away, I think, or is to have some empathy for the injured player, because you mentioned this loss of identity. So what does that mean? Many of us, we associate ourselves as tennis players. It's a big part of who we are. There's, of course, some danger to over associating who you are with your sport, but it happens, and especially it happens at the when we're younger or on a college team. And so when that's more or less sort of ripped away, you you feel like perhaps your purpose is not there any longer. And so we want to understand that from a coaching perspective, that hey, this player, a big part of their life has just been really disrupted by this injury. And they identify themselves very strongly as tennis players. It's a big part of who they are. So if we're in a team environment, or even I would say perhaps an academy environment, can we have empathy for that? But can we also try to give the player some role to contribute so they can be part of the environment? A big part of coming back from injuries is getting that social support to help you. Now, that can be family, friends, it could be your physical therapy, rehab team. But if you're on a team or you're in some sort of tennis community, that's a part of it as well. And we don't want to lose that connection to those people. So if we're thinking about a college tennis team, can this injured player somehow participate at practice, maybe as a volunteer coach or player coach? Could they do something with stats? Could they do something with video? Are there things that they could do to help out so that they feel like they're still contributing to what's going on? Even if you're with an adult league team, can you still go to the team's matches just to cheer them on, to be the support system for them? Um, then you'll still feel like you're a part of that. I remember a story that I have with respect to that is back in the early 2000s, I was on a USTA league team that went to nationals, and I was out, but I still made the trip, and just to go support them. It was also a nice place. Got to go to Tucson, Arizona, and so it was great to go out there, support the team, and just again be part of that community. It was a really fun trip, even though I didn't get to play any tennis. It was very nice, and all the people on the team and their friends and families really appreciated us showing up and doing that. And so that was actually a really kind of a cool thing to do. So I think we want to see if we can try to stay connected to coaches, to our fellow players, because that's actually going to help us psychologically get through that period of time so that when we do come back, we're in a much better place. We still feel like we're part of the team. Um, and we're not getting, I would say, I guess it would help out with that loss of identity is really what I'm thinking.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think I would say from my experiences, when players have been involved in the team as they've been going through that injury recovery process, whether it just means being there at practice, maybe helping to feed balls at times. That's something that I've witnessed that has been helpful. Getting players involved in practice or in matches. You mentioned keeping track of stats or doing video or maybe doing some sort of scouting of opponents during a match and trying to identify some strengths and weaknesses, but ways so that players can still be involved and still contribute to that team effort. I think is huge, and I like that story about you going down to Tucson and being there to help support the team, because when a player is a part of the team, it's ultimately not just about them. Obviously, it's
Right.
it's the team effort and the team result is ultimately the most important thing. And just because a player isn't able to contribute on the court in the way, and actually get the win for the team, it doesn't mean that they can't show that they're supporting the team in so many different ways. It actually reminds me a little bit of in a team setting, whether it be USTA or high school or college, when a player loses their match and they're, disappointed by, from losing that match, and the team as a whole wins. And it's okay, yes, we're going to be disappointed. Yes, maybe you feel like you didn't play your best, but we don't want, ideally that player is not moping around and all upset after the match when there's, the team result that was positive. So I think um, also during this stage, as we're talking about, a player going through that injury, another thing to consider is mental skills. We talked about how physical skills, such as your timing, can go awry and you may not feel match ready, but also things like focus and concentration, more on the mental side, can get rusty or can be a challenge upon return. So these are definitely things that can be honed off court as well as on court. And working with a sports psychology professional can certainly help with this process, as well as coaches can help at times as well. But thinking about some of these factors and recognizing that, especially if it has been an extended break, that when a player returns, they may not be able to withstand a 2-hour practice and be fully engaged and fully focused after an extended break. It may take some time to sort of work out that muscle of being fully engaged, of being, in the present moment and being focused on the task at hand, especially if a player has not been at practice or has been living a different sort of lifestyle over the past few months.
Yeah, and I think another strategy, because it's good that you mentioned the mental skills as something we can do during the injury break. Visualization or imagery is a nice way to get through that. So if we are on an extended break, adding in some more specific mental training, whether that be imagery, visualization, or some sort of meditation, or other types of things. It could even just be watching more tennis and analyzing it. It could be reading more about the game, raising your tennis IQ in certain ways. The more that you can be training your brain to handle, so for when you come back, and handle the return to play, the better. So I think one of the reasons that we often will suggest something like imagery is just the way it works in the brain is where you're creating that multisensory experience. You're going through the same neural pathways that you would if you were physically executing that activity. So the more that we can be doing that on our break, presumably the more the easier it will be to find your rhythm when you get back because you've still been working those neural pathways in your head. It's not the same, of course, as physical practice, but it's much better than zero practice. And so we can, you know, keep up the skills to a certain level by going through some of that. So that's where I think it's really good to work with a sports psych professional or mental performance coach on, let's come up with a good imagery plan that we follow during the week, through your rehab, so that we're still working on playing tennis in your brain, working on your confidence, working on the right emotional state, so that when you come back, it'll be a little bit easier to find those things. So I think that's definitely something players should consider when they're on extended breaks.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think one challenge at times with introducing certain mental skills when during a normal season is trying to time introducing a new mental skill, and then maybe it's introduced off court and then bringing that to the practice court, and then being able to utilize that in matches, especially if someone has a big match coming up, that can be a challenge. So when somebody has an extended break, this can be seen as a great opportunity to introduce some of these things without maybe the concern of, oh, I have a match this weekend. Is this going to be in my head going into that match? I've never, used this routine before, let's say. Can we practice that routine when we have a break from the sport, or can we practice meditation and learn that skill of mindfulness more when we have that time, when we have that break away from the court. And you mentioned imagery and visualization as well, which I think also visualizing yourself being out there and maybe enjoying the sport, particularly when players are playing day in, day out for many years without a break. At times they can start to get a little bit burned out, and maybe forget, and we've talked about this a little bit in the past, forget about some of those reasons why they got into the sport in the first place, that enjoyment, that passion, that fulfillment. So maybe during that break, players can think about, do a little bit of soul searching, and really, journaling, and think about some of these reasons why they play, why they got into the sport in the first place, and incorporate some of that and some of those feelings into the visualization and imagery process as well. Definitely, I think athletes should think about how they can build on their mental skills and potentially learn new mental skills during that time. And coaches and sports psychology professionals can definitely be a part of that process. And I would also add that in a team environment, which we've talked about, coaches can, as a way to help players not feel not lose that motivation, or not lose that identity, giving injured athletes new challenges, like, okay, let's take on this challenge of learning this skill that maybe we haven't spent too much time on, maybe something like imagery. So giving players new challenges and trying to help athletes find a new motivation, or a new mission, that, okay, this injury recovery is going to be my mission, where in the past I was spending 3 hours, let's say, between practice and strength and conditioning on being the best tennis player I could be. I'm going to be trying to spend a similar amount of time on my recovery. And what does that mean? Okay, that means being really diligent with physical therapy, or with my rest, or with learning mental skills that'll help me during this process, and also when I get back on court. But helping a player to understand that, okay, their new sport, their new performance now is that recovery process, and doing everything that they can do within their control. And again, certain things, especially during this process, will not be in their control, and also helping them to understand that, and understanding that frustration and anxiety about that process is going to happen, is common, but trying to control whatever they can, and trying to sort of rededicate themselves to this recovery process in a similar way to their dedication for the sport.
That's a great point, Josh. That's your job at this point. You mentioned it's their mission, this is their job. And the idea of can you be as professional in your approach to that new job, new mission, so that you can get through it faster, you'll recover better, you'll get back to playing sooner. I think this is where, when it comes to breaks and introducing mental skills, that tennis is a bit of at a disadvantage with respect to other sports. So when we go through training as sports psych professionals, we're often taught that the best time to introduce, mental skills training is during like an off season, or the second best is during a preseason. It's much harder during a season. And if you're a typical tennis player, maybe you're somebody who's more of a tournament player, it doesn't feel like there's ever an off season. With things like high school and college tennis, and to a certain degree adult tennis, depending on which leagues you decide to play in, there is usually a period of time in which you're not in your actual league. And I think this is where it's important for coaches and players to understand what we call like training periodization. So, can you have training blocks? Can you have recovery blocks? And then can you have competition blocks during your year? And if you can be disciplined enough to do that, then you'll find, forget about injuries for a second, you'll find times in your schedule in which you can build mental skills, but also maybe build some of your physical skills. Because you could say the same thing, Josh, with like learning a new thing in your game, like, oh, I've got this tournament coming up. Should I use this or not? And but if you've separated out things like, all right, we're going to take a month here, and we're going to work on a couple of things to help you in that next upcoming competitive season, then it gives you some dedicated time to do that. It could be the same with mental skills as well. And so perhaps with the tennis player, a forced break like an injury, excuse me, to help you overcome even burnout or something is a great time to introduce those things. So I think that's a really great point. I guess there is one break that is very unique to our time in history here, and that is we're seeing it much more at the college level. Is you test positive for COVID, or you get notified as like in contact tracing, you're a close contact, and now you're quarantining. And we're seeing this especially in college tennis. I would not be surprised now that high school tennis, at least in the Northeast, is beginning um, to see more of that with high school players. A player actually I just spoke to yesterday, he got close contact, and he got out of quarantine just yesterday, but it's happening. And so that's another type of break that we have to deal with. And I think I haven't had that happen to me, so I don't necessarily know the feelings of that, Josh. But I wonder, how do you think a college player feels when he or she tests positive, and how that relates to their team?
Yeah, I think it's really tough, whether the player themselves tested positive or whether they, are within close contact and because of that had to quarantine. I think there's a certain sense of guilt that can take place, where particularly if it's in an inopportune time, before a big match or something like that, that they feel that they can't contribute to the team effort, and maybe they're second guessing some of the decisions that they made, or some of the things that they've done in the past that maybe led to it, or even just feeling that they wish that they could be out there, playing matches, going and trying to win that important match that's coming up. But I also would say that loss of identity that we've talked about can take place, even if it's just a week or 2 weeks that player has to sit out, where they they maybe have settled into a certain spot in the lineup, or they've gotten accustomed to playing with a certain doubles partner, and all of a sudden that's taken away from them. And maybe it's something totally out of their control, like they were in close contact with somebody and then that person ended up testing positive and they feel like, hey, I didn't do anything wrong here. I didn't even test positive, and just because of this, I'm not allowed to compete. So could definitely be a sense of, not being fair, or this is being taken away from me. So feeling like it's not justified. But yeah, it's a unique challenge for these times. That's for sure. Um, I guess how would you help an athlete who's going through that? To deal with some of these challenges, and maybe how can they best handle it in the best way, whether that upcoming tournament or event is maybe the last of the season, or just some point during the season itself.
Yeah, I think it's a tough one too, because the other part of this is you're going to go into quarantine and you are going to be on your own.
Yep.
There's no come to practice and contribute or that, and it could be your entire team goes into quarantine. So it's important to somehow maintain some social contact with your teammates, whether that's virtual. I know everybody has some sort of virtual Zoom whatever fatigue these days. So many things have been done on that, but it's important to do that. I think some of the same strategies we were talking about before are useful. Remembering why you do this. That was actually a topic that I had discussed with a team, different sport, this past spring. They've been asked to do so many things just in order to have a season, and it was really good to remind them, okay, why is it that you play this sport? Why is it that you've made all these sacrifices to compete, at this point in time? And because a lot is being asked of athletes, especially at the college level. Many of them are being tested, 2 or 3 times a week just to be able to be cleared to practice or to travel. There's a lot going on. So I think it's good to show some empathy with it, with what they're going through, help them reconnect with their why. But when it comes to coming back, some of the same strategies we've discussed, imagery, remember some things, perhaps recall some highlights, watch some of your sport, watch some of your favorite players, and then do some imagery of you playing like your favorite player. So stay engaged with your sport so that when you do return, um, you feel like perhaps like you've never left. But I think that this one, let's hope that some of this type of thing starts to really decrease as we go through the summer months and into the fall. That this becomes less and less of a reason for people missing things. Um, let's transition, Josh, to we've returned to play day one. We're back on the court. What are some things that you think players should focus on? Think about should their goals be when they return to play?
Yeah, I think a big one is definitely trying to keep expectations low at the beginning, not expecting that on day one you're going to be performing at the level that you were um, in the past, or not expecting that you're going to be at your highest level right at the onset. We've talked about that quote of keeping expectations low and standards high. So trying to do whatever you can do to give yourself the best chance to perform at that highest level, and having high standards of yourself on each part of that process, whether that be the strength and conditioning piece, whether that be the mental skills piece, the technical parts of the game, and practicing those parts of the game and sort of finding that timing and that rhythm again. Um, Nutrition, hydration, sleep. So having high standards for yourself, but also keeping expectations low at the onset, and understanding that it will be a process to come back to your highest level, and setting some goals for yourself along the way. We've talked about that goal setting process, but being diligent and writing it all out, having trying to have a plan in terms of your recovery and setting some goals for yourself along that process, but also being able to reevaluate your yourself and reevaluate those goals, knowing that, hey, there could be setbacks along the way. This might be a longer recovery than I imagined. So being diligent in that process of setting some goals, but also understanding that, hey, it's going to take some time. Let's keep expectations low in the beginning and not expect that we're going to be at 100%, because that can lead to a loss of confidence, and that can lead to players feeling like, oh, I'll never get back to that point where I was. So if we're a little bit more realistic and start slow and just, okay, today all I want to do is really focus on my rhythm and really try to feel the ball and watch the ball and really try to get that good that feeling of, okay, being back on the court and feeling my strokes. So that could be a goal for a player at practice on a certain day, rather than, okay, I want to be back to where I was 2 months ago.
And I think that strategy, if you take that, just trying to get into a rhythm, keeping your expectations low, you'll actually find your game faster than if you're thinking in different ways. And so I think that that's a really good way to approach it, Josh. I think another perhaps positive emotion we can bring that first day is, can we be grateful to be back? Can we appreciate that, hey, this is tennis. This is where I love to be. I want to be on the tennis court. And perhaps just through that first practice, just really, in a way, be smiling inside that, yes, I'm back. This is what I love to do. And that'll be easier to keep if we're keeping our expectations low. If we, in a way, know that we're going to be off a little bit. But the goal is just to get that rhythm and that feel back. And that can start with you just focusing on your breathing, keeping your body loose, trying to have a nice rhythm with your breath, good body language, good energy while you're out there. Go back to watching the ball. It's a nice, easy, simple thing to focus on. You can start off with bounce hit in mini tennis, watching the spin of the ball, whatever appeals to you. Nice, easy focal points. Now, sometimes a player will have that on day one, it'll go really well, and then what happens on day two, the expectations get ramped up, and then day two isn't quite as good. Perhaps the magic here, perhaps the message, Josh, is we should always play it this way. Keep our expectations low, just try to find a rhythm. You'll find it faster and faster each day, but you're probably going to find yourself really hitting the ball nice and smoothly and solidly if you can make this kind of how you approach the beginning of every practice. So one thing that one of our past guests, Bill Tim, talks about, I think this is more of a philosophy in even say long-term development, but you could use this as part of your warm-up, this progression. And he gave it an acronym, CAP. So CAP stands for consistency. So that when you're first out there, can you just look to bring some consistency to what you're doing? Can you make several balls? Then A stands for accuracy. Okay. Now, once you've started to feel consistent, can you start looking to hit specific targets? And you're getting a rhythm with that. And then the last thing you add in is power. Now you can start at a little bit more pace, a little bit more racket head speed. That may corrupt some of the consistency and accuracy, right? So we want to dial that in different ways. But over the course of the practice, if you follow that progression, you should feel closer and closer to where you were prior to the break. It's not going to happen in one day, like you said. But that progression can really help you start to feel your game again. And then once you're in that rhythm, I think you can start working on drills with a little bit more variability. I think we talked about this in one of our recent episodes, the idea of block practice versus, some variability in practice. And players learn more through that variability. So can you start to add in some different shots into the drills that you're doing? Can you add in more mobility to what you're doing? And then slowly, may not be that first day, but it might be some point play, some match play. And we've talked about how often that's the last thing to come back because it's really bringing all of the skills together, not just the physical and technical skills, but it's bringing your tactical and strategic skills. It's bringing your mental and emotional skills, your whole competitive mindset. So you're bringing a lot more in there. And so the sooner that we can start integrating that, but also understanding it's probably going to be a mess at first. And I have experienced this as someone who you mentioned earlier, Josh, off air, that you haven't really had any major breaks, and good for you. Let's hope that continues. Um, but I've had some major breaks, and one of the things I've learned is coming back. The hardest part has been finding the competitive game again and understanding there's a process to how it happens, and you have to, in a way, expect a bit of ugliness to your play when you first begin playing matches again. And I think you see this even at the pro level. When a player comes back, they're often losing matches in the first or second round of tournaments. But it's again, it's like a process. You need to sort of screw it up and fail a number of times before it sort of clicks back in. And it will click in. And the more that you understand that that's the process, don't avoid it. Get out there, keep competing, be okay that it's going to be a little bit ugly, but trust that you will get it. And I think that's one of the harder things for athletes to do is to not let it get them down that they're not playing great. But it reminds me, and I think we talked about this, and I think we even put it in the show notes, the idea of fall 7, rise 8. And part of that was why 7, why 8. You're going to need to play a certain number of bad matches or mediocre matches before you start to get back there, before that light bulb comes on, like, all right, yes, click, I'm back. And so just, I would want to emphasize with players, know that that's the process. Don't feel like you're never going to get it back. You will get it back, but get out there, get those matches under your belt as fast as you can. Then you'll get back to where you were prior to the break.
Yeah, and you definitely see this at the pro level. I mean, I think about Federer, who's returning right now from a very long break. I think over a year break, and yeah, he's wise enough to not start that return right before Wimbledon. He's starting it many months ahead so that he has time to play those matches at the 250s, at the 500s, maybe at some Masters, and maybe not if he's not playing the clay season. But to get those reps in and know that it is going to be a little bit ugly, to know that there will be, he might not have his timing. His competitive spirit could not be at that same point where it was when he was, competing week in, week out at the highest level. But knowing that, okay, through that process of playing these matches, you start to get it back, and it does take time, but it does happen eventually. The other thing I would add to that is that as sports psych professionals, we want to be having those conversations with players ahead of time so that they're prepared for that. Because if not, it can be really discouraging. All of a sudden you're playing and maybe you're used to competing for championships, and all of a sudden you're losing in the first round or second round. And yeah, you're coming back from that injury, but that doesn't feel great. That can be a shot to your ego or to your identity as an athlete that identifies as being maybe one of the top players in the region. So having that conversation ahead of time and preparing that player that, hey, this will likely take some time. Maybe they're the exception, they come right back at their highest level, but for most people it takes time to find their game, to find that highest level, and losing is a part of it. And losing can also help that player to identify what aspects of their game are still maybe falling a little bit behind. Or okay, maybe it's my footwork and my quickness around the court, or my agility, or maybe it's some other area. Maybe it's my serve if it was something like a shoulder injury, or something like that. So those competitive experiences, and we've talked a lot about playing practice matches, which is definitely important during this time. But whether it be practice matches or matches that count. Those experiences can help us to see where we need to continue to put our focus and put our emphasis during practice, and to continue to work on. So I would say that it's definitely critical that players, once they're ready, get out there and put those reps in, knowing that it will take time to get to that highest level, and to be prepared of that process, and that can be a ugly, challenging process.
And we've talked about the concept of everything is practice. This is a really good application of that. Some of those early matches, and I'm sure Roger Federer will take this approach, is that in a way, yes, it's in a tournament, but these are basically practice matches to help me peak
Yep.
for a part of the season that I want to be peaking for. And if we look at it that way, perhaps we're not as judgmental about it. We can be a little bit more neutral. And as you said, there's a lot of information that's probably being given to us through the experience. Can we look at that in a more neutral, almost like scientific way, and say, all right, that needs to be fixed. Okay, we'll work on that. We'll work on that. Next match we have, we'll have a little bit better approach to that situation. And so I think the mantras that we've talked about a lot in our podcast episodes, keep expectations low and standards high, everything is practice. Those two things right there can be very helpful as you come back and try to get yourself to a place of where you're competing at your top level, or you're really comfortable with where you are. And just even researching how pros have done this. And I think you're right to point out Federer. It'll be interesting to see how things go. But even though he hasn't played tournaments per se, he's playing lots of practice sets. Now, of course, it's a little bit different playing in a tournament than it is on a practice court. But he is going through that process. So the top pros are often playing practice sets with their practice partners or whomever. And so I know that's a big part of the way Roger trains, and that may help him actually come back faster. We'll have to see. But the one I always think about is Juan Martín del Potro. Is someone who's unfortunately come back from a lot of major injuries, and I think he's on another injury right now, and hopefully he is able to come back. But he'll often have struggles in his first few tournaments, and next thing you know, it's the U.S. Open or Wimbledon, and he's hanging around in the quarters, the semis, and he's back, and he's super dangerous, just as dangerous as he was prior to the injury. So there are lots of players where we can look at these extended breaks and that they have come back, and we can learn from how they've traversed that journey.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I would look at Bianca Andreescu as definitely another example of that, where she's had many extended breaks, has had to miss many major tournaments, and then
Yeah.
you
Her
see
breaks seem longer than her times of playing, actually.
it's true, unfortunately, yeah. But she's been able to rise to the occasion, and to find her best tennis when she has returned time and time again, in a similar way to Del Potro, I would say. But no, I would agree that for athletes of all kinds, looking to the pros for how they've gone about things in terms of finding some best practices, but also being realistic, and understanding that yes, the recovery process could be longer than you initially imagined, or there could be setbacks, and to sort of know that ahead of time, so that it's not as challenging or disappointing if it does occur, but just knowing that is ultimately part of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, breaks are part of the process, and the more we understand how to come back from it, the more that we understand what can be happening psychologically, physically during the break, and what our worries about it, uncertainty and anxiety may be. I think the better that we can handle those things. Right. So, well, that's our show for today. I want to thank you for listening. For more on today's show, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions, please email me and Josh at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag tennisiq. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, which includes YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. We're also putting up notifications on Instagram. Thanks again, and we will talk to you soon in our next episode.